Welcome back to my little channel. Now, not too long ago, I talked to you about the problems I see when it comes to our environment. We're being lied to. Because obviously, we have all heard that CO2 is a huge problem. I mean, you have to be scared. You have to be so scared that you have to pay extra taxes. And a lot of people don't even realize this. But when does CO2 become an issue? And I did look into it. And in all fairness, it's because someone else told me about it that I started realizing, because before that I didn't even realize. The thing is, I knew CO2 wasn't a problem because if it really were a problem, we plant more trees. Deforestation does more to harm the CO2 level situation in our world than anything else. How do I know this? Well, because plants eat CO2 to create oxygen. And I know CO2 was some part of our global atmosphere, but I never realized how big of a deal it was. Till not too long ago, I came across something that pointed this out to me. And I'm like, wow, even though I'm pretty much against the whole be scared of CO2 bullshit, I didn't even know this. So there's a good chance that you didn't either. What am I on about? Well, let's start with this one. The carbon dioxide levels outdoors in just about everywhere in the world is about 300 to 400 parts per million. This equates to 0.04 in the concentration of air. The air is built up of nitrogen and oxygen and carbon dioxide and other gases. And out of all those, about 0.4% is carbon dioxide. Yeah, but that's really not something I can make big. 0.4%. Yeah, but when does carbon dioxide then become a problem? Well, the outside air is usually between 300 and 400 parts per million, but the inside air, I mean within a house, and you can see this here. I'll highlight this part a little bit. Hoppa. Carbon dioxide levels outdoor, usually between 300 to 400. Carbon dioxide levels indoor, usually between 600 to 800. Carbon levels indoors in an adequately ventilated space with heavy occupation. So let's say papa, mama, 2 children or more. You will have about 1,000 parts per minute. Not per minute. I keep saying per minute. I don't know why. 1,000 parts per million, which is double the amount of CO2 you will find in the big beyond. Because let's be honest, inside the house you will get up to a concentration of 0.1%, whereas outdoors it's 0.04. So yeah. Heavy occupation, by the way. What does that mean? You sit and watch television together. That's basically it. It's still not a problem. Carbon dioxide levels that go above 1,500 to 2,000 parts per million are likely to be reached only in unusual circumstances, either a closed area or etc. etc. Now, most houses that are ventilated will probably not reach the 1,000 parts per million. I mean, you will get a slight increase, obviously, but if you have somewhat of a circulation of air, it will be less than that. But how much is a problem? Now, there is an interesting question, because that doesn't really get explained here, though what they will tell you is that at a high level, toxicity is going to be a problem. Now, once the air is 100% carbon dioxide, we're long dead. We're long dead. There are people who will say, you know what, 5%, or it's even said it here, 5% above the normal levels, no, not 5% above the normal levels, toxicity of carbon dioxide becomes an issue once it reaches about 5%. It's not 5% higher than the normal levels. No, 5%. Okay, so how much are we talking about? well, then we're talking about, and it's actually all red here, so I don't have to do it. 5% would be equal to 50,000 part per million of gas in the air. That would be a problem. How far away are we from that? Well, considering that at the moment we're at 400 parts per million, and the closest danger level is at roughly 5,000 parts per million, so that's not even the 50,000 parts per million they are talking about in here. Because I should show you that one. I guess I really should. The thing is that according to the British Health and Safety thingy, no, it's called differently, sorry, Health and Safety Executive, because executive sounds so much more important. But according to them, long-term exposure is dangerous. Okay, so what constitutes long-term exposure? Well, a period of 8 hours in an enclosed environment with roughly 5,000 parts per million. If you can hold on to that for 8 hours, after that you really have to go outside and start breathing a bit of fresh air, so to speak. Yeah, that's a lot. 5,000 parts per million. That's 10 times more than what we have outside. That's 5 times more than heavy living. I'm sorry, I can't stop thinking about it. So if you have a family of 5 people watching television, this will be 5 times that. So crack open a window and the problem is gone. But yeah, this is a problem. A short-term exposure of 15 minutes becomes a problem when it's about 15,000 parts per million. It says so right here, by the way. I didn't highlight it. Silly me. Here, down in the bottom. You can pause it and read the rest. But yeah, these are the moments that CO2 are becoming a problem. Okay, now, are you suitably scared yet? No? Still not? I can't blame you, because there's really not a reason to be scared. Why? Well, as I said, and it's not me saying it, as the article showed, it's about 400 parts per million that you will find outside. 300 to 400 parts per million, sorry. Okay, well, that sounds interesting. So, what are people talking about when they are using tactics to scare you? Now, that's a very good question, because they do scare us a lot. They just don't want you to realize that you're being scared. Can I give an example? Of course I can give an example. Don't I usually do? This is just one of the many you will find out there. I'm not going to even link this one because there are hundreds of articles like this. But global CO2 emission rise for the first time in 3 years. In a worrying development, global CO2 emission from energy jumped by 1.4% in the first increase in 3 years. Now they do add from energy, because energy is the biggest producer, and energy creation is the biggest producer of CO2 done by humans. There are other causes of CO2, by the way. Humans aren't the only ones who create CO2. Forest fires are a huge creator of CO2. I think the forest fires in Indonesia, and we haven't heard a lot about the forest fires in Indonesia, so I'm not quite sure how big of a deal it is, but it is a big deal. The forest fires in Indonesia created about as much CO2 emission as the whole country and the whole industry of the country of Germany. About 900,000 kilotons of CO2 produced by Germany is equaled by forest fires in Indonesia. So, just to put it out there, we are not the only ones creating CO2. If the air is really hot and areas start drying out, plants start rotting. And when plants start rotting, they also emit CO2. Roughly 3% of all the CO2 in the world has been created by humans. I'll get to that. Maybe I won't. I'll probably get to that later, or I'll get to that in a different video. The thing we're worried about now is, do you feel afraid? Because we have an increase of 1.4% of CO2 emission. But let's assume that we have an increase of 1.4% of CO2, which they are not saying. They're saying the emission has gone up. But I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt, and I'm going to say, you know what? All the CO2 in the world is created by humans. This is bullshit, but let's pretend this is true anyway. We just heard about how 300 to 400 parts per million is what we see on average at the moment. I think it's about 405, 411, I'm sorry. This was the highest measured parts per million of CO2 in Hawaii. I think this is the highest point found in the world on average, not above an exhaust pipe obviously, but globally. So if we take 1.4%, then we say 400. 1% of 400 is 4. 0.4% of 400, let's pretend it's half. Is 2. So then we go from 400 parts per million to 406 parts per million. And that's not what they're even talking about, because they're talking about less. They're talking about emission rise because of energy production. And energy production, which may be about 80% of the total CO2 production when it comes to humans, but humans aren't 100% of the CO2 production. But even if we're going to calculate it on 100% of the CO2, then still it's not even a drop on a hot plate. A drop on a hot plate would have more effect than this, but you're being scared. Are you scared yet? You should be scared, because reasons. What makes it even worse is that they keep pushing this. Now, we know that if we really want to do something about CO2, we need to plant more trees. Now, they're talking about how they will tax you more. They're talking about how you can't use planes or trains or automobiles, unless of course you use electric automobiles, because reasons. I never understood that. I mean, if you create electricity, you have to offset the carbon for that. The cheapest way of creating electricity is nuclear when it comes to CO2, but we're against nuclear. Then the second cheapest way of creating energy is burning stuff. But burning stuff creates CO2. Actually, burning stuff creates 80% roughly of all the CO2 created by humans. Yeah, well, can you base that on anything at all? Well, yeah, you know, I can, and I will. You didn't think I would you? There we go. According to the European Parliament, greenhouse gas emissions per sector, 78% of all the greenhouse gas emissions in Europe are based on energy. And this is all sectors, including land use, other than forestry. No, including forestry, land use change and forestry. So that's kind of funny, because you'd think if you plant trees, that's a deficit on greenhouse gas emission. But, and that's something they don't really say, yeah, but a lot of forestry at the moment in Europe is based on letting stuff deal with itself. So trees dying and rotting, etc., which is a form of, how do you call it? Rotting. Rotting is fermentation, and fermentation releases CO2 in the atmosphere. Actually, it releases more CO2 in the atmosphere than all the other things combined, but that's a different story altogether. 78% of the greenhouse gas emissions per sector is done by energy. And out of that 78%, 80% is carbon dioxide. So the biggest producer of carbon dioxide in the energy sector, in the industrial sector, is the energy sector. And all of this combined in Europe creates 4 0.451.813 kilotons. So this would be a megaton and this would be a gigaton. So Europe creates about 4 gigaton of CO2. Are you suitably scared yet? Now, obviously, Europe isn't a country. I made this video not too long ago. Europe isn't a country. Europe is a combination of countries. The biggest producer in Europe is Germany. Germany creates about 901 kiloton of greenhouse gas, which is a problem. I'll not deny that. But forest fires in Indonesia created at least as much, probably even more than 900,000 kiloton. So even if Germany wouldn't do anything, Indonesia, not the industry in Indonesia, not the people in Indonesia, but a forest fire in Indonesia, which is created by drought, apparently, created more than Germany. Do I have a link to that article? I don't think I do. I'm sorry. I'm not the sharpest tool in the shed today. I know, because it's so annoying. I can tell you where I got it from, and maybe you can see it too. Why not? If we look at this is from Al Jazeera. You know, that great producer of scientific content. Well, that's unfair. But okay. El Nino contributes to high CO2 levels according to a NASA study. Okay, the amount of atmospheric CO2 is likely to top 410 parts per million in this year. Now, this article is from 2017, and I've heard that we've already reached 411 parts per million. It may be true. I think it's true. I don't know. I can't really produce that fact. I came across it once, and well, in all fairness, if we go from 4.10 to 4.11, that's nothing. That's a little bit more wind on that day, or a little bit less. And going from 4.5 in 2016 to 4.10 also, that's, sorry, it's really not worth it to mention. As I said, if the wind blows a little bit harder, you're going to get different readouts. Now, CO2 is mostly prominent, abundant, and measurably greenhouse gas responsible for keeping the world warm enough for life. So it's actually important. It is just a downside to the whole CO2 is bad for us. It's important. We need it. Without CO2, there will not be life on Earth. Never mind that. Do we really think it's too high? Because, hey, we've had way lower than this. I think in the 1950s they measured it at 200 parts per million, which is 250, which is a little bit less than half of what we have now. A little bit more than half of what we have now. But okay, yeah, whatever. So then we continue reading. Now, increasing burning in fossil fuels since the Industrial Revolution has driven up the amount of CO2. Are you scared yet? But in 2016, El Nino, one of the largest on record, caused abnormal but accepted heat and drought in the tropical region of South America, Africa and Indonesia. These three regions released 2.5 gigaton more carbon in the atmosphere than they did in 2011. 2.5 gigaton. I'd like to remind you that a moment ago I showed you that Europe creates about 4 gigaton of carbon, the whole continent of Europe. And this is just because the wind is blowing in a different way. It's not that industry has gone up by this much in South America, Africa and Indonesia. No, it's because the wind blew. El Nino is basically a wind pattern. So yeah, no, because of that, we had a rise of 2.5 gigatons of carbon just in these areas. Is this the only one? No, but we know about this one because they're honest enough to tell us about this. Is this the only one? No, but again, we know about this one because they're honest enough to tell us about this. Is this a huge issue? It's an issue. Yeah, sure, it's an issue. Why did this happen? Well, according to NASA, the CO2 atmospheric pressure went up because of the heat. I'm sorry, I gotta go to this one, I think. The OCO, Orbiting Carbon Observatory, which is a big satellite which measures carbon dioxide. Never mind. That were 50% larger than the preceding non-El Nino years and equate to about 3 parts per million, or 6.3 gigatons of carbon. This is, I think, more than the whole continent. No, not the continent. This is more than America creates, I think. In the industry in America creates about 6 gigatons as well. This sudden increase occurred even though the emission from humans of activation has estimated to remain roughly the same. So the El Nino effect added 6.3 gigaton of carbon. A wind creates so much carbon movement that it seems to create the same amount as the industry and people in the country United States of America create. Why is it that people don't talk about this? We don't have effect on the weather, I think. I mean, I know there are people who believe that we do. I still don't believe that. I don't think we have effect on the weather. So imagine my surprise. There's a wind, and because of that wind, we have an increase, a huge increase of carbon dioxide. But you have to stop driving your car, because by driving your car, you're creating carbon dioxide. And the thing is, even with all the greenhouse emission caused by, well, let's be honest, everything I've mentioned so far, we are still only at 411 parts per million, and we're slightly below that, but I'm going to argue that, you know what, 411 parts per million is okay. Even if we would absolutely double that, that's still not an issue. If we go to 5 times that, not an issue. 10 times that. 10 times that might become an issue for us. So what can we do to offset this rapid growth of CO2? I'm sorry guys, there is no rapid growth of CO2. I just mentioned that we would survive it. I'm not saying it is happening. But let's pretend that, okay, we go from 400 parts per million to 4,000 parts per million. How can we offset that? Plant more trees. I keep saying this. It's so fucking simple. We know that CO2 is a great motivator to give plants more energy, because they basically eat carbon dioxide, they breathe it like we breathe oxygen, which is their piss and poo. Basically, plants exhume oxygen and inhale carbon dioxide. We inhale oxygen and exhume carbon dioxide. It's almost as if there's a balanced thing going on, but that balance thing is slightly broken now that we've been taking down a lot of trees. I seem to be getting back to the whole tree thing a lot. Maybe this is a good time for me to say, you know what? Don't believe the global CO2 and economically illiterate ecology mafia. That sounds like a lot of words. Don't believe the ecology mafia. That's basically better. Don't fall for that bullshit. People, there are plenty of things in the world that we need to fix. CO2 really isn't one. But if we want to, we can plant more trees. Anyway, I've been ranting for quite a while. That's it for now. I hope you enjoyed the little talk I gave you. Links will be provided downstairs, and I hope to see you all soon. Oh, and I'm sorry, but my rabbits really want attention, so that's what you're hearing, rattling the cage. I hope to see you all next time.